Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
He's not my hero. I'm not fucking idiot. If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that we would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela is eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez said.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
Welcome, everybody, to the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Gustafson, and with me today are Brandon Madsen, a member of the Reform and Revolution Caucus of DSA, Anya Parampil, and Max Blumenthal of Gray Zone. And hey, thanks you guys for being on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, for sure.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. So if you turn on any major media news outlet today, the refrain that you're hearing is sweeping praises of Joe Biden's executive orders and whatnot, and changes of policy to roll back, the Trump administration's policies. But of course, one thing isn't going to change on January 19th, so the day before the inauguration. Joe Biden's nominee for Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, basically made the announcement that one of the policies that won't be changing is the recognition of Juan Guaidó as the president of Venezuela. This is a man who was never elected to that position and running contrary to the international community's continued recognition of the duly elected administration of Nicolas Maduro. Blinken told members of the U.S. Senate at his confirmation hearing that Biden would seek to more effectively target the sanctions on the country, and which, of course, have the purpose of attempting to oust the duly elected president of a foreign country, which is, of course, contrary to the basic tenets of international law. Blinken said the new administration was going to look to more humanitarian assistance, which we all kind of know is a cover for usually imperialist intervention. So I think what's important for the conversation, I wanted Max, Anya, and Brandon to come on to talk about, I think just in general, Venezuela. Obviously, I think when anyone hears anything about socialism, a lot of the discussion is like, well, do you want to end up like Venezuela? And I think that I want to, take that on a bit, but also talk about Maduro and the Bolivarian revolution sort of going forward in the new Biden era. So in order to do that, I think context is necessary, and I could go deep into the weeds on this, but I think it's really important to kind of understand how we got to where we are. And you can't talk about Venezuela in the 20th century without talking about Hugo Chavez. And so, going back before 2000, the Venezuela is, essentially after the sort of secession from the Spanish Empire and the breakdown of Gran Colombia, it becomes its own independent state and is in many ways a puppet state for U.S. imperialism, especially throughout the period of the Cold War. The left-wing opposition's fractured, unorganized. And in the 90s, an officer by the name of Hugo Chavez attempts to have a coup to oust a U.S.-friendly government in 1992. The coup fails. Chavez calls it off. He gets arrested and imprisoned, but he's freed just 2 years later when the person that they would install, Rafael Caldera, gets elected to president. So after that, Hugo Chavez tours Venezuela and around Latin America, spreading this kind of message of a new Bolivarian revolution, going back to Simon Bolivar. And I think it's fair to say that the two poles of this movement are anti-imperialism, being mostly aimed at the United States, given the fact that the U.S. has the Monroe Doctrine and the belief that it can do whatever it wants in this hemisphere. But then the second pole is sort of social investment. To me, creating basically sustainable social democracies in Latin America. And this is something that wasn't just happening in Venezuela, it was happening in Brazil and in Ecuador and Bolivia and other places in South America. But Chavez would call this socialism in the 21st century. So leading up to elections in 1998, Chavez is able to kind of organize the disparate radical left in Venezuela that are opposing both traditional Latin American conservatism, but also these IMF-friendly liberal parties. And the message of social investment and a turn towards the working class gets him notoriety, and really pointing the aim of the government towards the people who have been in the history of Venezuela and most of Latin America the losers of the economic distribution. So in probably the most free and fair election in Latin America, Chavez was elected the president of Venezuela in 1999. He gets within a month of in office, Chavez begins the first stage of his revolution, the Plan Bolivar, which makes massive investments into infrastructure, offers free medical care, puts price controls on basic foodstuffs, and tries to make it a little bit easier for the worst off in Venezuela. Then they do this major constitutional reform, which is the first thing they got to do is constitute a constituent assembly, which will then write and ratify a new constitution. And this movement towards a constituent assembly gets 80% of the vote, so it's highly popular. Most of the people elected to the constituent assembly are Chavez supporters. They win big. And so they've got this mandate to enshrine these socialist principles into the Constitution. So, and then that Constitution has to get publicly ratified in a plebiscite, and you get 72% approval. So the new Constitution basically solidifies Venezuela as a social democracy. It guarantees economic, social, cultural rights. It creates a unicameral government in the National Assembly, and it's now the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. So, and in the first re-election after the new Constitution, Chavez gets elected and but backs up his anti-U.S. rhetoric by signing an agreement with Cuba to supply it with oil, a commodity which Venezuela has in some of the largest reserves in the world, in exchange for Cuban doctors' assistance in these Bolivarian missions that would come out, one of them specifically designed to increase healthcare. So at the same time, or around this time, Chavez begins to nationalize the oil industry in Venezuela, basically taking more and more control over the proceeds of the crude oil production and using that as a kind of vehicle for investments being made as part of the Bolivarian missions, which are aimed at alleviating poverty, building social housing, providing education, and maintaining and enforcing indigenous rights, instituting election recalls, which I think is pretty important, and very importantly, land reform. So in 2002, continuing on with his anti-U.S. foreign policy rhetoric, that finally went, in the eyes of the U.S. planners, too far, because he replaced the board of directors of the PDVSA, the main oil company, with allies of Chavez, basically solidifying control over oil production and cutting off some of the flow of profits to U.S. corporations. So that leads to a coup, a CIA-sponsored coup against Chavez, which was successful actually in getting Chavez actually out of the country for a while. But millions of Venezuelans pour into the street calling for a return to Chavez, and that essentially forces the hand of the coup. Chavez is returned to power, but this allows the U.S. to maintain its position with this opposition, calling it sort of humanitarian intervention. So throughout the 2000s, the government maintained these Bolivarian missions, greatly increased the standard of living of all Venezuelans. And as the election of 2006 came, Chavez organized various parties into a single united Socialist Party of Venezuela, which was, a radically democratic organization where, even as Chavez put it, the bases will elect the leaders and it'll allow real leaders to emerge. So as the end of Chavez's legal presidency came to a close, there was term limits. A new constitutional commission was formed that basically said, look, the constitution that we had done, the Bolivarian constitution, is a good constitution, but we could go farther. We could enshrine more rights and we can guarantee more things. And so they were getting ready to call a constituent assembly, but didn't sort of get that far. And instead, you get a referendum to eliminate term limits, allowing members of the United Socialist Party and Chavez to run in the next elections. At that time, though, Chavez got sick, went to Cuba, was treated for a tumor, which basically they found out to be cancerous, was feeling better, decided to run in the elections, had to head to Cuba for more treatment, but won that election again, but died in March of 2013, at which time his vice president, Nicolas Maduro, announced the death of Chavez, with this moving eulogy, and a kind of new era in Venezuelan history was just beginning. So that's a long kind of introduction, but I think it's important to give that background. And so I've encountered many people who will tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to Venezuela because I have not been to Venezuela. But Max and Anya, you have been to Venezuela. So I'm wondering if you could kind of pick up a bit of this lesson and give us a little bit of an explanation as to the sort of administration of Nicolas Maduro and the response of the U.S. and other nations who now recognize somebody else as the president of Venezuela.
Who wants to go first?
Pick your poison.
I guess I'll try to address the more difficult aspect of Maduro coming into power after Chavez's death, since you gave a pretty concise intro explaining some of the achievements of Venezuela since 1998 and the Bolivarian Revolution, the signing of the 1999 Constitution. But I think when we understand Chavismo, we have to look at it in terms of the democratization of Venezuela. Because if you look at any mainstream media piece right now, the New Yorker has a piece about what Biden intends to do in Latin America. The author casually refers to promoting democracy in Venezuela, or Biden aims to return democracy to Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And what do they mean by that? They mean bringing Venezuela back to the pre-Bolivarian period, in which the Punto Fijo agreement still dictated the rules of politics. And this is an agreement that made Venezuela, was signed in 1958 following the military junta of Marcos Perez Jimenez, which was, not the worst dictatorship in Latin America. But the Punto Fijo Pact established this power sharing agreement where it was really two parties, although it was initially signed by three. But the two parties, COPE, which is sort of modeled after the Christian Democrat center-right, Northern European style party, and Acción Democrática, which is AD, also a very European style social democrat party. And they established the parameters of politics. So it's center left and center right, and they just trade power, enact basically more or less neoliberal economics. In the few periods when there was an attempt to get out of the neoliberal consensus under Carlos Andrés Pérez, they failed. And it led to more economic disaster, like the Caracazo riots in 1989. But the point I'm making is that more than half of Venezuelans who were living in extreme poverty were completely excluded from this political system, which very closely resembles the U.S. political system, except in a developing country. It was a classic fake democracy. There was massive repression in the 1970s. There was much of the population was simply unable to vote, or were not even allowed to vote. And in rural areas in the Campo, where the Chavismo draws its base, there were no polling centers. So Chavez, his model was based on social inclusion, and in putting justice above all else, social justice, that was enshrined into the 1999 Constitution. So Chavez began bringing polling centers into very poor, ignored rural areas. He brought polling centers as well as social services into places like Petare and these poor barrios around Caracas or Maracaibo, places that were like not even on the map before then. So when we think of Chavismo, we have to think of it in terms of the democratization of Venezuela. But our political class, our media elite, they don't understand what democracy even is. To them, democracy is the fetishization of voting, in which two parties trade power and never go beyond certain parameters into anything resembling actual socialism. So that's, I think, where we have to start the base. That should be like kind of the baseline starting point for this conversation. You mentioned the 2002 coup, and Chavez ushered in a great period of economic prosperity following the breaking of the PDVSA strike, in which the kind of middle managerial class attempted to prevent PDVSA, the state oil company, from fueling the Bolivarian revolution and providing all those ignored masses with social programs. And by breaking it, Venezuela was able to be recognized by the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN for its Zero Hunger Award. They were able to be recognized by UNESCO for their Zero Illiteracy Award. With their Zero Illiteracy Award, they were recognized by the UN for the Misión Vivienda project that Chavez instituted, which housed initially 1 million families. And then Chavez dies at this very pivotal period during the second Obama term, when the economic war of the US begins and coincides with a drop in oil prices, which was somewhat geared. People don't understand this. The plunge in oil prices, which deeply damaged Venezuela's economy, was not an organic phenomenon. In fact, there were meetings between Secretary of State John Kerry and then King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia to increase production at Aramco, the Saudi state oil company, to undercut Russia, Venezuela, and Iran. This is when the U.S. also wanted to turn the screws on Iran so it could implement, so it could get a better Iran deal. And this was the upshot for the Saudi king and the Saudi regime was that they would get more support, diplomatic and military support from the U.S. in Syria, a country where they were seeking regime change at the time. So Venezuela was put in a very difficult position. Nicolas Maduro comes in. He was the foreign minister under Hugo Chavez, former leader of the bus drivers bus drivers and transportation union, a very important union. He's from Caracas. Chavez was from the Llano. He was from the rural plains, and he rose through the military. So he commanded a lot of respect within the military and among the a part of the population that didn't really recognize Maduro. Maduro had no experience as an executive, had to acquaint himself with the military. What's more, after Chavez's death, the CNA, the Central Electoral Authority of Venezuela, had 1 month to carry out a national election against a increasingly powerful opposition. And this is something that I think the United States would have never been able to accomplish. I mean, look at how disastrous our last election is. Maduro wins by a narrow margin, and then he faces this economic war where by 2015, the United States has declared Venezuela a national security threat. It's made it impossible for Venezuela to obtain foreign credit. Standard & Poor's, Moody's, they begin downgrading Venezuela. Other banks across the world are afraid of not complying with U.S. sanctions. And the economy begins to tank. And internally, Leopoldo Lopez, the leader of Voluntad Popular, the right-wing party, Popular Will, that was cultivated through the U.S. CIA cutout, the National Endowment for Democracy, who's funded by USAID, owes his whole career to the United States, son of aristocracy, one of the wealthiest families of Venezuela. He leads La Salida, which is a violent campaign of riots that makes the January 6th Capitol riot look like a Shriners parade, and leads it for years. These are what's known as the guarimbas, blocking off parts of entire cities in Venezuela, costing the economy hundreds of millions of dollars. Maduro was facing all of this right when he came into office. And what me and Anya have been able to witness, and maybe she could talk about this a little bit, is how the Venezuelan Bolivarian revolution under Maduro, but with the help of social movements and so many of the elements of society that were lifted into prominence by this revolution, how they defeated what ultimately became a full-scale U.S. coup that saw several attempts at military coups.
Yeah, Anya, I'm curious, about the perspective you have having, on the ground in Venezuela. What is it like? What does it look like, in the Maduro era? And, I mean, there is this backdrop of an economic war, yet there's still the kind of wellspring of the Bolivarian revolution in terms of the social conscience and social cohesion and things like that. What does that really look like?
It's something that's been incredible to witness. Max and I I've spent about 3 months in Venezuela over the last 2 years, and that's starting in February of 2019, just following the U.S. recognition of Juan Guaidó as the president of Venezuela, and most recently this past December, where Max and I covered the parliamentary elections in the country. And when I first went to Venezuela, we hear so much in the media about what is truly the suffering. Of course, remove any context about the sanctions and how suffering is the intended policy of these sanctions. But we hear so much about how terrible this situation is, that people are eating their dogs, that people are starving in the streets, that I expected something even worse than what I saw. I was going in with an open mind, thinking that things could be really bad, as much as I want this to be a success story. And I was surprised, because especially following the declaration of Juan Guaidó as president, when we arrived in Venezuela, the feeling on the ground and the picture you get is just so different from even the reality that I expected as someone who's critical of mainstream US media. There was no feeling whatsoever, first of all, that the government was about to fall anytime soon. Things were normal and calm in the streets of Caracas. There were opposition rallies. Juan Guaidó held large rallies. Of course, that contradicts the narrative that Venezuela is also this repressive dictatorship. There were massive rallies of the opposition held in the street, including outside of a military base, on the day that the United States was threatening to invade Venezuela. That was February 28th of 2019, when the U.S. put all of this aid it claimed it was going to deliver through the Colombian border, and used the U.S. military to push it through. Venezuela was able to defeat that attempt at an invasion through the support of its military, something that Maduro, even considering his background, which Max described, has successfully maintained. And that's really what makes the difference, I want to stress, in countries such as Venezuela. That can be the difference between a successful coup or the survival of the state. And just look at what's happened in Ecuador or in Bolivia in recent years, or Brazil, where gains have been overturned, and in some cases outright military coups have taken place because the revolution, the social project, wasn't based in the military. It wasn't defended by the military force. So that's one area where I think Venezuela's really thrived, and that's clear when you go and you talk to people there. They were very proud that they were facing down this attempt at a U.S. invasion and a U.S. coup attempt. One thing that was really just incredible to observe when we first arrived in Venezuela in February of 2019 was seeing hundreds of people lined up in a public square, Simón Bolívar Square in Caracas, to sign a letter simply denouncing the U.S. coup, the recognition of Guaidó. And
I would say it was thousands and thousands. I mean, the line was endless.
Well, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people around the country, absolutely, because this wasn't only taking place in Caracas. But all of those people were just there to sign a letter that was directed at us, really, to say that they don't recognize the United States as the decider of their fate. And that was really a testament to me to how strong the revolution is still, in spite of the economic war. And what Max laid out following Chávez's passing, the United States truly believed that Chávez was, and he was, a unique historical figure who had achieved something for the entire continent of Latin America, really. And so they thought if he was taken out, if he died, that the whole project would fail.
The same thing they said about Cuba, right? As soon as Fidel goes, like the whole system will go, because apparently all of these political systems are built upon the, idol of a single person in their eyes.
And while it's true that these people do play a certain role, a unique role in the course of history, Venezuela proved to be a project that really outlasted the man, because ever since Chavez passed, the United States has sustained an attack on Venezuela in the forms of these violent protests, immediately starting in 2014 with the La Salida campaign, again the next year with the National Security Declaration, which is the first step in strangling its economy, cutting it off from international capital. In 2017, more right-wing Guarimba protests, attacks on the country's Supreme Court through right-wing militias, essentially. And so that level of sustained attack, and in some cases they block the streets, they strangle the economy, and that's led all the way up to the recognition of Guaidó. And as you say, in some cases, overt military coups. On April 30th of 2019, Juan Guaidó actually led a military uprising in the street of a few dozen soldiers. He was trying to inspire something wider. Again, that was a testament to the strength of the revolution within the military and support for the ranks, and the importance of maintaining support within the ranks of the military for a country such as Venezuela. But these are completely, they're talking about sedition with what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. What do we call that? Treason. And this is still walking freely in Venezuela. So that's, I guess, to address your question without rambling too much, the picture that I get from the ground is that the support of for this project is still very much alive. And we saw that again this past December when we witnessed the parliamentary elections, which the opposition boycotted. Again, essentially at the behest of the United States. We can almost surely be certain of that. And so it lives to fight another day, thanks to this wide support that it has in the military and in other bases of society, which I'm sure we can get into, talking about the social movements and the expansion of the state.
Where the hell does Juan Guaidó come from? I know, I've read about him and some, there's, he's obviously another person that organizations like USAID and stuff are kind of responsible for creating, but he isn't really well known it wasn't really well known in Venezuela. And he's sort of a part of this opposition that there's like two kinds of opposition in Venezuela. There's a far right opposition, and then there's like a sort of less crazy, like what normal kind of opposition force. And Guaidó represents this far right, and it doesn't seem to really represent anybody in Venezuela. So Max, can you give the 30-second, where the hell does Juan Guaidó come from?
Well, he definitely does represent an element in Venezuela that is upper middle class, upper class. They have their own kind of, they live in Eastern Caracas, for example, and you can go meet his supporters. And I would say most of his supporters do live in Miami or outside. Mm-hmm. At this point, his family lives in Spain. He was a cadre of Generation 2008 under the leadership of Leopoldo Lopez, who I mentioned before, who's the real leader of the Venezuelan right-wing US-backed opposition. He was called by Spain's prime minister like the Nelson Mandela of Venezuela. I think he's more like the Nelson Muntz of Venezuela. And Guaidó basically is a stand-in for Lopez. It's like Lopez has his hand up Guaidó's ass and is just going like that. And Guaidó's running around doing what his masters want him to do, which is seize as much assets as possible and destabilize the country as much as possible. This Generation 2008, they were trained by a CIA-backed outfit called Otpor or Canvas, led by someone named Sergej Popovich, who was a leader of this so-called student group that overthrew Milosevic through creative tactics and, kind of like protest as a form of hybrid warfare. They used Gene Sharp's tactics. And they brought it to Venezuela, except it wasn't nonviolent as Gene Sharp promoted. It was, as Anya described, La Salida, the Guarimbas, they were very violent. I mean, people were literally burned alive in the streets who were identified as Chavistas. People were beheaded with wires that were put across streets during blockades. And Guaido was a part of that. Our article, The Making of Juan Guaido, that I co-wrote with Dan Cohen, it shows Juan Guaido in one of the Guarimbas with a gas mask on. And that's how he kind of got his credibility. He was elevated to this position not because he was the de facto head of the National Assembly, but because the de facto head of the National Assembly, who was next in line, because there were 4 rotating opposition right-wing parties that took turns to take, he was too white. He had blonde hair. I even forget his name because he's so insignificant. But he looked like if Brandon took a clean shave or something. And they can't have that kind of guy representing the true president of Venezuela. So Guaido comes out. He was mestizo, his father's a taxi driver. So they just chose him, and he kind of vaguely looks like Obama. And the media campaign promoting him begins, and the Venezuelan state is managing, or the Venezuelan security apparatus is managing this situation very carefully. It's a very delicate situation where Juan Guaido's job is basically to get arrested or killed. I wouldn't want to take on the job that he's in. I would be very afraid of any of my friends and allies because I'm worth more to them dead than alive. But it's actually the Venezuelan security apparatus that's kept Guaido alive and free, because he was basically placed there as a provocation. And the ultimate outcome of Guaido's fake presidency has been just the theft of literally billions of dollars of Venezuelan state assets. They've been able to just justify that on the grounds that, the Venezuelan state in Caracas, in Miraflores Palace, it doesn't exist. It's really this guy, Guaido. So we're just going to give him everything. And we don't know where that money's going. He's extremely corrupt, but it's just, we're talking about $8 billion in gold in the Bank of England that was just seized by Guaido's people. And I guarantee you, me and Anya would see them around Washington. They're at their little retinue, led by this kind of this white collar hooligan named Carlos Vecchio, who's from like an upscale family of Italian immigrants to Venezuela. They're running like the Venezuelan exile lobby in Miami and Washington. And we would see them around town. Like they'd be drinking, our friends would be like, I saw him at a fancy bar, like one of his like henchmen. And where's that money coming from? Like, how are they paying for all this? They're just looting the Venezuelan state. And Anya's piece, I think, which actually was kind of made a huge impact in Venezuela on the mechanisms they were using to steal Citgo. Anyone, if you've seen a Boston Red Sox game, the Citgo sign, or you see the Citgo stations, that's Venezuela's most valuable foreign asset. And the goal of these white collar criminals was to basically steal Citgo and separate it from PDVSA and put it in the hands of basically the US, so that Venezuela was deprived of all of that revenue, which ultimately is leading to starvation, mass migration, destabilization. And it really is a wonder that they've been able to hold on despite all this. Guaido is now a completely diminished figure, and the EU has de-recognized him, which is significant.
Yeah, and this is a guy who just sort of pronounced himself the president of Venezuela, supposedly because the Constitution allows him to, but because the Constitution of Venezuela says that if the president can't, the same thing as kind of the 23rd Amendment, right? If the president is incapacitated or unable to be the president, then somebody else needs to take over the duties, which is supposed to be the vice president. But apparently, under their position, the whole election that got Maduro in the election was invalid. This being sounding fairly familiar now, and therefore we can just declare ourselves the president. And the United States and Western Europe go along with this complete and obvious usurpation of electoral politics. For all the bullshit that we're hearing about the citadel of democracy being attacked and our democracy being sort of under attack because of these threats of election fraud and stuff like that, the United States is supporting someone who claimed election fraud and then just declared themselves the president of the country. Like, this to me is like a sort of obvious farce that that you have to be willfully blind to not see. Like, it's just ridiculous. I want to bring Brandon in here for a second because you've been very patient and quiet, but I want to hear your perspective, because I want to like kind of zoom out a bit. I want to talk about like so much is talked about Maduro as a personality, and even Chavez as a personality, and I want to talk about the politics of this and talking about the kind of lessons that it learns, especially for those of us who are watching this podcast, right? We're talking about people on the radical left, people from a socialist perspective. And so a socialist perspective on Venezuela, like what do you kind of see, looking at the political history since 1999, and what lessons do you think it teaches us?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot to glean from that. Before Chavez came to power, after decades of decadent so-called democracy in the 90s that was really just pro-capitalist governments acting in the interests of the rich in society, in the interests of international capital. I think Chavez was definitely signified a break with that system, and without a doubt, it was seen as a revolutionary upheaval in the minds of the people who had lived through the 1990s, which was a decade of hunger, extreme poverty, brutal repression under the bipartisan leadership of both social democrats and Christian Democrats in government. And there was also mass opposition struggle during that time. There were indefinite strikes in many parts of the public sector, including health and education. Venezuela was similar in many ways to what we have seen more recently in, say, Greece, Spain, Portugal. And so the revolutionary left in Venezuela, I think is highly influenced by the politics of the Cuban Revolution and the former Soviet Union, and had fought for decades under extreme, brutal state repression, with thousands of people disappearing and dying. And so by the end of the 1990s, the left was almost destroyed, as they made up a significant part of the people who were killed or disappeared. And so those factors, I think, combined with the total absence of support from the social and Christian Democrats for the class interests of the masses, and the deepening of neoliberal politics and so-called reforms, I think that all had a huge impact on the middle layers of the Venezuelan military. So, unlike a lot of other countries in Latin America, a lot of soldiers in the middle and upper layers of the military in Venezuela come from working class or peasant backgrounds, which I think helps sort of explain some of the outlier characteristics about the National Bolivian Armed Forces, their sort of radical nationalist character. And Chavez knew this, of course, and so therefore was able to help lead the civic military coup in 92 that had elements of a military uprising that, and of course, although it failed, it transformed the political scenery, and sort of presented this radical left nationalist populist alternative. So I think when you get to the Bolivarian Revolution, I think, this was essentially, it ended up being the first revolutionary upheaval of the 21st century that put forward the idea of socialism in the post-Cold War world. It was after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the declarations of international capitalism, that they had won, that this was the end of history, this is the only viable social, economic, cultural, political model in existence. I think it's in my opinion, I'm going to criticize Chavez to some extent during what I say, but I think it's clear that although there are a lot of weaknesses that I would like to point to, I also think that there are, I want to frame it to start with in the context of this is a positive revolutionary change from what came before. But I will say, I don't think, he didn't put forward a program at this moment that was actually capable of defeating capitalism, or even in the first few years, he didn't use the word socialism, didn't talk about socialism. That sort of came into the picture more in the aftermath of the attempted coup in 2002. The coup and the lockout, and there was a big radicalization of the masses that took place during and after those events. And so I think, things like advocating for revolution and the need to change the system, raising the idea of socialism, I think doing this at a time when no other political world leader was going to advocate something like this, I think that was very significant. And that had an important international impact and on people's consciousness, especially a layer of young people. But I think it's not just Chavez's words and actions over the last years that have confirmed, the need to overthrow capitalism. It's, the actions of the masses of Venezuela, and of course the recent just world events taking place that have proved capitalism, is a system for the 1% of society. And so I think it's very relevant to look at sort of how did this project go in Venezuela over this whole attempt since 1999. And I think the government's correct in the way they pose things, that when they say that the capitalist class is parasitic and it lives on the profits of petroleum and the importation of goods and services and manufactured products. But I think at the same time, we've seen the Chavez government not be willing to sort of take decisive action to take that class out of the picture, and to really put all the sort of levers of power in the hands of the working masses. I think the government has tried to sort of walk this line. I know, one could argue that it's positive that Venezuela's leaned so heavily, that Chavez and Maduro have leaned so heavily on the military because it allows them to resist these types of coups, and it makes sense to sort of can maintain this privileged position for various layers in the military and prop that up. But I think that's also, I agree that that's true in the short term, that it helps keep the regime in place. But I also think that it acts as a barrier to breaking down the capitalist state and putting something else that's sort of not a military bureaucratic apparatus, but a working class democratic structure in its place. And I think you've seen the government try to operate within the limits of capitalism. So they've introduced economic measures, a few years ago, there was a currency devaluation that I think put the weight of the economic crisis on the working class and the poor. But at the same time, of course, it's the working class and the poor that the government relies on for its support. But at the same time, they're not willing to sort of they didn't nationalize, the commanding heights of the economy. They did it very selectively, the oil industry, petroleum industry. And so I think there's this interplay where they're trying to sort of balance between the pressures of the masses and wanting to provide for the needs of the masses of people, but wanting to do that in a way that doesn't sort of trigger the capitalist class to go sort of all out in overthrowing it, which I think is sort of an impossible line to walk. And it just sort of makes me think back to the regime of Salvador Allende in Chile in 1970 to 1973, where I think he tried to do something similar, where he, was the first socialist elected through sort of bourgeois democratic means into the highest office of a country, and he was ousted in a coup. And he tried to take a similar approach, where he tried to, enact genuine reforms that would help people, but try and do it sort of through the official structures of the capitalist state, through the parliament. Let's do this all above board. Tried to sort of calm down workers that wanted to go seize the means, and peasants that wanted to go break up the landed estates. Like, no, let's do this the official way through the parliament. And I'll I'll have the military enforce it. I'm not going to arm the workers and have them go do that. And so I think he obviously was ousted much more quickly, whereas the regime in Venezuela is still going. And I do think actually a key factor, besides it just being a different point in history, is the fact that Venezuela has this massive oil wealth. And so they can do these sort of partial measures of nationalizing just this one sector and still provide a lot of services that make people's lives better, and sort of not be as immediately faced with this question of, like, either you take the commanding heights of the economy into public democratic workers' ownership, or you cave to the corporations completely. They're sort of able to use this oil wealth in doing this balancing act. And so, but I think without that, they might not have lasted this long, precisely because of sort of the tack that it's taken. And I just think, the unfortunate reality in my mind is that Maduro, I think there was always some of these weaknesses under Chavez, but I think Maduro has sort of doubled down on that and even signified a bit of a break from Chavismo, I think trying to sort of placate the capitalist class and the right-wing forces even more, and sort of thinking that you can calm them down. Whereas I think, the only real answer is to go toe-to-toe with them directly, and to put power in the hands of the organized working class, that the military apparatus is never going to sort of be a reliable ally. I think they have been so far, for some of the reasons I mentioned, as well as just because they do have a lot of perks and privileges compared to other layers of society, the military and bureaucracy do. But I think obviously, if that's a major factor in keeping someone on your side, then someone else can come along and buy them off too. So that poses dangers. And it was, again, it makes me think of Allende, who the one who led the coup against him was his own top general. And so I certainly am not saying this because I want any of that to happen. I am extremely for the revolution and want to see it succeed. I'm in favor of socialism, but I say this just to try and paint sort of what I see as the honest, multifaceted, picture of what's happened and the experience. I think it's been a mixed bag. I think it's been absolutely a step forward, and the international, imperialist powers, like, talking crap about the Venezuelan regime, like, are totally hypocritical and cynically doing it. They have no moral high ground to critique anything about democracy or standard of living in Venezuela, given their role and given how undemocratic, certainly in the US, our own politics are, and the rule of big money. But nonetheless, I think, just what I would like to see is something like a program that was like nationalization of the banks, and all the sort of big corporations, monopolies, oligopolies, nationalization of the means of production under democratic control and management of organized workers, popular revolutionary transformation of the armed forces through soldiers' committees, where there's democratic and recallable elections that are held by planned, community revolutionary defense committees, extension of the social missions in health, in work, and in housing, national plans to improve access to free, high-quality public services, again, administered not by a bureaucracy, but by workers and community control and management, and centralizing and making a state monopoly the foreign trade, imports and exports, so that you end the sort of speculation, the run towards speculation and the flight of capital.
Essentially
and,
protecting against
general,
these are all the kinds of things that in some ways would protect you against what we've seen happen in Venezuela. Like, to me, when I look at this, right, in Latin America, like, very crudely, but there's a Cuban model, and then there's the sort of Allende, Lula da Silva, Chavez, Evo Morales model, right? Now, okay, Max, this is where you're shaking your head, and this is where I'm interested in this difference in perspective, because you see the ability of the Cubans to resist a significant U.S. imperialist attempts at taking over the government, invading, like actual invading, and then having this really long and continuing embargo. Yet the sort of structure, as much as there may be criticisms, legitimate criticisms of it, is able to not be subject to internal pressures at the same time as it's subject to external pressures in the way that you see in Brazil and in Bolivia and in Ecuador and in Venezuela. And so when I look at the missions, like Brandon said, I'm very much in support of the goal of social democratic missions, and I think it's a good thing to enshrine social, economic, cultural rights in constitutions and have programs that actually put money where your mouth is and those kinds of things. But if I look at the structures of the actual economy overall, Venezuela appears to look like Norway. Now, its rhetoric and its international position is anti-imperial, whereas obviously Norway is very much in line with the Western imperialist NATO kind of forces. But it has a main natural wealth that it uses in order to fund social programs, and it has a internal sort of democratic institutions to a certain degree, but that there is still very much a capitalist class who's been able to put pressure on that. And you might have reforms that come in, but there's pressure to pull those back, and you don't have the kind of defense that you do in a place like Cuba, where you don't have those forces internally in society. And so I guess, this, you can kind of boil this question down to can you really call what's happening in Venezuela socialism? Obviously, that depends on what you define socialism as. And so as a way to answer this kind of question, to bring out this disagreement to answer the question of, is Venezuela a socialist project or a socialist country? I'm curious about how you would respond to this. And Max, since you were shaking your head, I want you to start.
Well, I was just shaking my head because of the conflation of Chavez or Chavismo with Lula da Silva and Allende is just fundamentally not correct. And Chavez and his economic policies, he designed his economic policies in close collaboration under the tutelage of Fidel Castro. And there are really two lines in Latin America right now. There's a social democratic line which runs through Bolivia, would encompass Lula da Silva or Dilma Rousseff, and Uruguay's last left-wing government, but
Argentina.
Mm-hmm. But John Bolton was fundamentally correct when he singled out the troika of tyranny as the three countries that operate under governments that are truly aspiring to a kind of socialism. And that's why they're on the front lines against the imperial assault. But Anya, I don't know if you wanted to respond to any of those critiques before I get to anything.
Well, I would just say one thing that makes what happened in Venezuela under Chavez different from what happened in Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, is that they did actually change the nature of the state. They rewrote the constitution. That's part of the reason why the project has survived. In Brazil, it was very easy for the right to take over and undo all of the social programs and gains made under the Workers' Party because it wasn't actually enshrined in the constitution, whereas Venezuela, from the very beginning under Chavez, and then began another process under Maduro, more recently after the opposition did take over the National Assembly and try to undo housing rights and take back some of the public gains made under Chavez, they began the process again of rewriting the Constitution and adding these social rights to the law of the land. And it's important to point out that when Venezuela goes through that process, it's not just typical elected officials coming in and writing the Constitution. It is workers. Workers are incorporated into the state. That way there's actually a quota for a percentage of fishermen and different kinds of working people that have to be elected in order to write the Constitution. So I think the idea that the workers are excluded from the state in Venezuela is, I mean, they wrote that wrote the law that makes up the law of the land. But more importantly, on the question of the economy, Venezuela has been a petrol state for almost 100 years now. It was in the 1920s that oil was discovered in Venezuela. It has the largest oil reserves in the world. The entire economy for decades before Chavez was based on oil, was based on the petroleum economy. And so, as you pointed out in your introduction, Kevin, the moment that Chavez even began to just take steps to nationalize and socialize that industry, which is the heart of the country, there was a complete strike and suffocation of the economy. There was a coup. They actually removed Chavez from office, and it was only thanks to popular swell of ground support that he was returned to power in the country. That was what happened when he just tried to take the most important step you could take in a country like Venezuela and nationalize the oil industry and then use it in order to invest in society. I guarantee you, if he'd gone further, I mean, I don't know where this other alternative exists where suddenly you have workers controlling the state the next day and everything's nationalized and banks are nationalized and everything's centralized. That is, I mean, you can look at what they did in Cuba. There's a reason that they don't have a reactionary capitalist class the same way they do in Venezuela. It's partially because Venezuela was such a rich economy where there was just a complete different kind of class, and it's a huge country, unlike Cuba. But I mean, they were much more violent with their ruling elite in Cuba. They essentially were killed or had to leave the country. And so I don't think Venezuela could have gotten away with that at some point in the last 20 years. I mean, that's really what you're talking about if you want to go up against the capitalist class in Venezuela, because they've controlled the state since it was founded, and now only in the last few years have we really seen, through their continued defeat, the more violent they get, the more absurd they get in their tactics, the more they fail. Now people are leaving the country, and there's more Venezuelans coming to Miami, and they're making up this network of people that are now funding coups to try and invade Venezuela and kidnap the country's president, as we saw with the Bay of Piglets invasion last year. But I don't know how they could have survived taking a more drastic step than they already have when they've tried to. It's only led to massive strangling of the economy and violence. So it's hard for me. I think it's easier to sit sometimes and discuss the theory of what we would like to see, but when you're actually practicing and in a government, these questions are very different. And so, do you risk losing all of the gains that you've made? Do you risk leading to, I mean, what we saw in Bolivia when the right takes over? That means people are massacred, that they would have to purge Chavismo in a very violent way in order to succeed in a coup in Venezuela. And so that's actually what you're risking if you're going to take some sort of hard, aggressive line against the capitalist class. It's a tricky balance. And ultimately, Venezuela is trying to survive in a capitalist world. So I don't think you can just abandon the system. You need money. You need to be able to fund your programs. And so
they're trying to survive under the Monroe Doctrine, which has always been in place. And Chavez came into power in a way that enabled Venezuela to develop the country and provide for a majority of the population that had been completely ignored, because it was the 21st century socialist model, because Chavez was so attached to holding elections and gaining popular consensus. Well, I think he only lost one election, the 2008 referendum, before the 2015 National Assembly election, which was disastrous for the country in the midst of the Guarimbas and the whole economic war on Venezuela. But Chavez created this consensus when he, instead of taking out the capitalist class and gunning them down in stadiums, how would that have worked out? right under the US's watch. It would have been the perfect opportunity for the US to just send in the military. He didn't have the Soviet Union, as Fidel Castro did, to place nuclear missiles in Venezuela, as Khrushchev did to defend the Cuban Revolution. That's why there was a Cuban Missile Crisis, because the Soviet Union existed and was willing to step up and put a socialist country under its protective sphere. There was no country able to do that. And so Venezuela had to choose another model operating totally on its own in a time of total unsheathed, unchecked US hegemony. And it did it. And it continues to do it today. I would recommend anyone watching this, if you're still watching this, because we're going long, watch my interview with the vice president of Venezuela, who is effectively guiding the economy, Delcy Rodriguez. No, you can't. These are the people leading Venezuelan state are workers and the sons and daughters of Chavez. They are the sons and daughters of real revolutionaries. Delcy Rodriguez's father was tortured and killed during the Fourth Republic in the 1970s because he was part of the political wing of a militant leftist socialist movement that was fighting for national revolution. He was tortured to death. And she served under Chavez, and she's trying to keep the revolution alive. And all of the parts of the economy that were nationalized under Chavez, particularly the patrimony of the state that enables any and all social programs, many of which have continued through the CLAP program, providing near free food to 3.5 million families, or Misión Vivienda, the free housing program, housing 3 million families. She's trying to keep those alive, but you can't keep them alive if you are under sustained unprecedented US attack. You can't start nationalizing all of these industries and nationalizing everything and then giving land to everybody. And they're continuing to give land to many poor campesinos, by the way. You can't do that if you can't pay for it. And the Venezuelan state can't pay for anything right now because it's completely blocked. It cannot export oil. It has to do so secretly. It has to, I mean, they've had to barter with Iran, apparently gold for fuel, because they can't even import fuel to power their economy. They sit on the largest oil reserve, but it's heavy crude. How do they convert that crude into fuel without access to US refineries? They can't do it. If you can't do that, how are you going to nationalize everything and then power the economy purely with state money? You can't do it. It's impossible. So to call for the Venezuelan government and its socialist government to continue nationalizing everything, to nationalize literally everything, is fantastical, because it ignores empire. It ignores imperialism. It ignores the whole historical and political context that Venezuela exists within, where its economy has been ground to a halt and it's continued to survive and continue to provide for the poorest people in this crisis. So the anti-blockade law is something that Delcy Rodriguez is presiding over. And this law allows Venezuela to have a productive economy when the sectors that it previously depended on have been rendered non-productive by the US economic war. And they've been criticized by these small ultra-left parties, which received like 2% of the vote in the legislative elections, because nobody really takes them seriously except for some college students and very highly ideological people who don't really recognize the economic reality and are they've run this. I mean, those parties ran this ridiculous media show, this kind of soap opera campaign, where they ultimately turned to the New York Times, one of the enemies of the Bolivarian Revolution, to do this hit piece on Maduro and the government. And they're opening up sectors of the economy, minerals, various other resources, gold, and they're bringing in foreign investment. And they are being criticized for not being transparent enough. But if you're transparent with who is investing in your economy, then what happens? It's a thing called overcompliance, where the Trump administration began imposing secondary sanctions on any company or person that would invest in Venezuela's economy. So companies are so afraid to do anything there, they overcomply and just simply pull out completely. So they're providing blind contracts to people. They're turning to countries like China, which have embraced a very similar model of not exactly immediately going towards full-scale Marxist-Leninist model, but operating along those lines and working within the sphere of capitalism in a socialist direction long term. And it's clear that they're moving there under Xi, where his anti-poverty alleviation program has literally wiped out poverty across China. So China is coming in to help Venezuela. Chinese investors are coming in to help. And this law, which is being criticized from the ultra left, I think is very important in keeping the revolution alive. The revolution has to be fluid, adaptive, and very practical. And we see the sons and daughters of Chavez. I mean, the foreign minister is literally the son-in-law of Hugo Chavez. And the vice president is the daughter of a revolutionary killed by the neoliberal government. These people are trying through the best means available to them to keep it alive. So I think it's important from, when we're sitting here in the imperial core in the global north, and the best thing that socialists have to offer in this country is Bernie Sanders, who just voted 2 weeks ago to confirm the warmongering Secretary of State of Joe Biden, who is probably going to raise an approving mitten for Neera Tanden, that they keep Venezuela in proper perspective and understand the context there. And just quickly to respond to the point about Allende, there was before Allende, there was Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. This was, I think, one of the first Latin American socialist elected leaders. He was more of a social democrat. And Arbenz brought Che Guevara and Fidel together. They were observing what was happening there. I think they met in Mexico City, and they saw very clearly that it was this military that was the central point of penetration and infiltration for the CIA, which allowed them to sabotage Arbenz later than Allende. And so the civil-military alliance of Venezuela is central for preventing U.S. and imperial infiltration. It's a large reason why the coup has failed. But there was also another dimension to Allende and his inability to be protected sufficiently. And that was that the population, there wasn't a sector of the population that was willing to take up arms to defend him or able to take up arms. And Venezuela has its colectivos. They have taken a very strong step that a country, a social democracy like Argentina would never do. This is something that really distinguishes Venezuela from these other countries. And the colectivos are heavily demonized in US media precisely because they provide such a point of obstruction to the destabilization campaigns and the infiltration campaigns that US intelligence wants to wage. It's an additional barrier along with the civil-military alliance. And we've seen the civil-military alliance rise to the fore during not just coup attempts, but attempts to sabotage Venezuela's infrastructure. The El Palito oil refinery was nearly destroyed and attacked in December 2020. If it had gone down, the whole economy would have gone down. We saw the attack on Venezuela's electricity grid in, April of 2019. Mm-hmm. And the civil-military alliance, the military and the civilian engineer corps, they managed to repair it and get back online again. But these kinds of attacks, I mean, economically, through all aspects of hybrid warfare, are something that we cannot even imagine in the U.S. And if you're a socialist, you have to incorporate that into your analysis before you criticize them for failing to embrace your blueprint, your ideal blueprint for what socialism truly is.
Brandon, I want to give you a chance to respond, but I do want to leave a little bit of time for us to talk about the Democratic Party and its like perpetual fucked upness. But I want to hear your response, Brandon.
Yeah. Well, first off, I think Anya and Max make a number of points that I agree with, a number of really good points. And I think there's probably, we would agree on a lot of things. So just to lay out what some of those are, I think I certainly do not discount the role of international imperialism. I think that is absolutely crucial and has to be taken into account at every stage. I think that that's a given in a way. And I think that But I guess my take on why I don't think it's fanciful to go further is I'm not under the impression that the capitalist class and international imperialism are like, holding back right now, like, oh, they would do more if, the government went further in trying to nationalize more things, then they would do more than they're doing right now. But they're safe if they don't do that. I think that the threat is still there, and it's because I think the threat
No,
will
it's because
continue
they've done so much. It's because they've done so much. There is no money to pay for any further nationalization. It is just economically impossible because they have done so much, because they're so vicious.
So I think just to step back, I think looking at how to carry out the nationalizations, yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not saying that it has to be on the basis of paying the capitalist owners of the current capitalist owners. I'm saying seizing those assets. And I don't want violence. I'm not like wanting that to take place. I do think that violence from the capitalist class backed by US imperialism is in the cards.
Obviously, it's already happened.
One way or another in the future. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that is a feature of the situation. And so, the question was posed like, do you want to risk losing all your gains? Like, no, I don't want that risk. I think the risk is there though. And so, I think it's a genuine question, what is the best path to take that, you can do to secure your gains and push further in the direction of genuine socialism. And I'm certainly not critiquing, I'm not saying that it's easy to figure that out. And I'm not questioning the genuineness of the desires of the leaders or criticizing their backgrounds or anything like that. But I do think, and it's not like I want Venezuela to follow my preconceived blueprint. And so I'm, upset that that's not happening. No, I just genuinely want it to succeed. And so, based on my belief of what it looks to me like it will take to succeed, that's what I'm going to put forward. And, if they do something else and it works and I'm wrong, that's awesome. I hope that happens. But, I don't think, I'm not for gathering up the capitalists in stadiums and gunning them down. That's not what I'm advocating. But I am for seizing their assets and doing so swiftly and across many different industries. And I do expect them to resist. And I think that in order to, resist to their resistance, it is going to take a working class organ of power being formed to actually be robust against something like that. I don't think that the current armed forces are fully reliable in that sense. And again, I'd love to be wrong.
I think the question
and so
for me,
I would push back on the
I
would push back on the Chile.
One second, like when I look at this
Sorry,
dynamic, right? It's the question of like you see a lot of popular support for the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela. You do have there is a massive base of support for those projects and for what's going on, and it's shown in elections and it's verified, in a number of different ways. And so I think the kind of disagreement that's really happening is the question of the role of that organized support, right? There a lot of that because of Chavez's focus on doing things to be elections, which you can understand and which is a good representation of popular will and all these kinds of things. It's something that you don't have as often or as vivid in Cuba and things like that. You can understand why much of that support is geared towards elections and elections ratifying actions and the kind of movement of politics in that direction, in an electoral direction that is able to accomplish a lot of things and a lot of things that we want to be in support of. I think that the kind of disagreement or the kind of misunderstanding or the misalignment is that I think Brandon would argue that that kind of popular support may be more effectively mobilized towards processes of taking over industries and valuable things, starting with the commanding heights, but then going down using that groundswell of support from the working class to engage in that process, in some ways, not maybe like in conjunction with, but not instead of rather, but there is a kind of devil's bargain in some ways. It seems like if you mobilize support towards elections, you can get that support, you can win elections, and you can do things, and that's important. And things have happened in Venezuela that we should be in support of. But that mobilization has not been towards economically, like, gaining economic power in the same way that it has been mobilized towards political power. And so, like, you could see that as a criticism. I'm not sure that it's really a criticism. I think it's a sort of difference in approach. And the question is, given the ability of the capitalist class inside of Venezuela to fund and continue to reap the benefits of Venezuela's economic activity, I mean, most of the businesses in Venezuela are privately owned, you have limitations in the moving that popular support in elections, and rather than in that economic sphere. And so that, to me, is the kind of main question. I think there is a criticism of saying, like, moving that in the election sphere gets you elected and allows you to do things as the elected administration, but it means that you are not necessarily focusing that in the economic sphere, and there are consequences to that. And one of the consequences, you could say, is that continued pressure by the industries that are maintained in private hands, that maintain that capitalist class. And I don't see that as an unfair take, or an unfair position on the limitations of turning towards electoral politics. That's, I don't know. Do you agree with that, Brandon? Do you see where I'm coming from, Max? Huh?
I agree with some of that, and there's one point that I really wanted to make, though, about international imperialism, which is, I think another aspect is, I don't believe in the possibility that you're going to build a stable socialist regime in one country in a capitalist world. Mm-hmm. And so, I do think, I mean, when the idea is called fanciful, that you could, just take the right policies and do everything by the book, and then you'll have socialism in Venezuela and it'll be great, even though the rest of the world's capitalist. I agree. That's totally utopian. That's totally fanciful. And I don't think that that's possible. And so I do think it's absolutely incumbent upon socialists and workers around the world to, play their part in staying the hand of U.S. imperialism and other imperialist powers from intervention. And I think, that's been the case in revolutions throughout history. I think the Russian Revolution itself, would have probably, almost lost, and it could have lost potentially if not for movements against foreign intervention, sort of limiting some of what could be done by the invading powers. And so I do think that is a crucial piece. And so I don't want to, I'm not trying to make this seem simpler or easier than it is. I think quite the opposite. I think is a very difficult fight with a lot of questions. But I guess to me, what also seems unrealistic is the idea that that things are moving currently in the direction of socialism, and that through the state that you have in Venezuela, which in my mind is still a capitalist state and a capitalist economy, that's sort of equipped to be able to carry out the tasks of building socialism. And I think that, I disagree with the claim that in Chile in the 1970s, there was no section of the population able or willing to take up arms to defend the regime. I think that there were workers clamoring for arms to defend the regime against a coup. Oh, okay. I misunderstood that. I didn't mean to mischaracterize what you were saying.
The government didn't mobilize. That's what I said.
So look, I think
I would agree with that. Yeah,
I think that what we can agree on is essentially to be steadfastly against U.S. imperialism in general, but particularly U.S. imperialism, and that we should support the Venezuelan Venezuelan government and the Bolivarian process as far as it can go. And maybe we have critiques or concerns about the limitations of where it can go, but where it's gone so far has been positive, and if it can go farther, we should support it. I think that we all agree on that point.
We have a specific job, and I mean, I'll turn it over to Anya, but just quickly, and we both got to go pretty soon, but we have a specific job. We are here in the US in the heart of the most powerful, vicious empire in human history. And our job is to limit the effects of it, to get in the way, to put ourselves in between it and its targets. And that's what I'm going to put my energy into. I could spend, it'd be very easy to criticize other countries that are under attack. But that's just what my job is. I think it's the job of anyone who cares about, just at a basic human level, cares about what happens to people under sanctions. The US sanctions are the greatest human rights crime taking place. They're a much greater threat to humanity than the entire pandemic. They make it virtually impossible for these countries under sanctions to actually get the pandemic under control. We see what's happening, how vaccines have been blocked from Venezuela, and Juan Guaidó has refused to release any of the money that he controls to pay for them. So fortunately, Russia's selling 10 million Sputnik 5 vaccines. But that's the situation they're in, and we have a specific job here, and we should play it. And it's why it makes me so furious when I see publications like Jacobin, which claim to believe in socialism, publishing arguments for regime change in places like Nicaragua and Venezuela. They're not doing their job. They're making the real anti-imperialist job harder. And just I guess the last point I would want to make here is that when these countries go from socialist or socialist oriented or flawed socialist or not perfect socialism to back to the so-called liberal democracy, which really just represents neoliberalism, they're like Poland, they're like Honduras, they're like Czechoslovakia. They go to the far right and they stay that way, and that is a regime in itself, regardless of which figure is in power. Juan Orlando Hernandez, Andrzej Duda, whoever, they're a right-wing, ultra-national or nationalist, neoliberal regime, and there's so few cases that we've seen of them going back to socialism after they flip. So let's keep that in mind when we think about Venezuela and what is on the other side.
Anya, do you think we have any hope in the Democratic Party of anything changing in terms of Venezuela, or do you think it will get any better, any worse?
Well, I guess I would end on an opportunistic note, not about U.S. policy, but that the reality is U.S. policy has a weaker and weaker grip on what the outcome, or it has a weaker determination on the outcome of the situation on the ground in Venezuela with each passing day. And I take the view based on my experience there, seeing the massive state investment, seeing the youth-funded orchestras, and seeing people living in housing missions that were formerly military bases that are provided by the government, seeing the CLAP program, seeing my friends get their Christmas ham from the government, and everybody going out and getting their ham, and seeing that kind of socialist program taking place under such a heavy U.S. economic war, it gives me reason to believe that the project is going to survive. It's because of the points that I've made about the military. I think the military is reliably in the camp of the revolutionary project. That's just what's been demonstrated time and time again. And people get peeled off here and there. They get bought, but they're never successful in raising a military uprising. If you've been to the country and you've interacted with the military and you see its presence, I think you can see that it's not flipping anytime soon. And the government is thanks to its international partnerships with countries such as Iran, countries such as Russia and China, the government's finding new streams of income. And this isn't just something that's unique to Venezuela. This is a project for the entire world that exists outside the sphere of U.S. influence. In 2019, in Venezuela, I attended the ministerial summit of the Non-Aligned Movement, which is the largest UN member bloc, 120 countries, basically all the countries in Asia and Africa, Latin America that aren't controlled by the United States, or in Europe. these countries all got together, their top diplomats came to Venezuela and they met. And the major theme of the discussion, and this is including Russia and China now, originally they weren't part of the non-aligned movement, but they're now observing members. That's the majority of the world's countries. That's where the future is going. And they were all talking about the devastating impact U.S. sanctions have had on all of their economies. These are African nations, Asian nations, Latin American nations. Russia and China also subject to sanctions, two huge powerhouses politically and economically in the world. And so these countries are all coming together and discussing how they're building an alternative financial system that won't be reliant on the dollar. It won't be reliant on London and Paris and Washington and Switzerland in order to make transactions. They're just building an alternative structure. And we've never reached that point in world history in the global capitalist economy since the United States took over as the reigning imperial power. We haven't actually, even though there was this period of time where there was the counterweight of the Soviet Union, there was never an actual threat that the United States would be surpassed as the largest economy in the world, or that these countries could all come together and actually exist without relying on capital and finance centers based in the West. And that's really, that's what's happening now. It's hard for us, I think sometimes I'm in Washington, D.C. It feels like we're the center of the universe, but I think that's increasingly changing. And I think that will have a positive impact on Venezuela, and it will give Venezuela more space to carry out the kind of more socialist reforms that I think we would like to see, that I think people in the government would like to see. And I would just stress that it's their process. They've had to defeat the opposition. It's like they're constantly on this boat that's been rocked back and forth. And the minute that they can just be stable, I think we can start talking about where they would like to go forward. And now that the Socialist Party is back in control of the National Assembly, now that Juan Guaido's coup is completely defeated, he's not even in the National Assembly anymore. He has no claim to authority in Venezuela. It's possible that some of these steps that we would like, that Brandon describes, take place, but it will be debated through the Venezuelan system. And so we'll have to watch it. But I would just stress that I'm putting my money on Venezuela's survival based on just what I've seen, not only from Venezuela, but from the rest of the world. And in my conversations with diplomats from Russia and other countries that have been targeted by U.S. imperialism in this way, I think the world is changing for the better.
Beautiful. Brandon, I'm going to give you a concise ending to this conversation.
Sounds good. I mean, yeah, I think that the future is unwritten, and there's absolutely the potential for this to go in a good direction going forward. I basically agree with what Anya said about that Guaido is out of the picture, essentially, at this point. Like, it might have been more of a serious threat at some earlier point, but, or it seemed like it could have gone a different way. But I think, at this point, the immediate danger is past. But that said, I do think that there are still structural issues that are going to be faced by Venezuela. And of course, like, U.S. imperialism is still going to play a really negative role. It will always find new ways to sabotage. And I agree, that it's a high priority for leftists in the U.S. to resist anything that U.S. imperialism is doing around the world. I just think in order for the Venezuelan regime to put up the strongest resistance to that's the most likely to win, I do think it's going to be necessary to sort of redouble efforts towards moving towards socialism and defending socialism and socialist policies, which I do see. I'm skeptical of the PSUV bureaucracy doing that. I think that there have been sort of really brutal price increases that people have faced, and promised wage rises that were sort of offset by inflation and things like that. That I worry that is going to run the risk of undercutting some. I agree that there's still widespread popular support for the regime, but I also think people can get impatient and frustrated if the economic difficulties continue or worsen. And so I do think that there will be new challenges that will need to be faced, and sort of none of the questions have been resolved in either direction. I think, none of the outside pressures from capitalism are going to go away, and U.S. imperialism and other forces. Neither are the, strivings of the Venezuelan masses to reach a better world. And I think that there will be a lot of questions as to how that plays out. I don't know what direction things will go. There's always the possibility that the project sort of gets revitalized. But I do think, sort of, if I'm honest, what we've seen so far of the approach from under Maduro, I do think that there's a risk that it adapts too much to the capitalist way of doing things, adapts too much to the right wing and big business, and risks it. I completely agree with what Max was saying, that when these revolutions are defeated and goes the wrong way, it's not pretty, and I don't want that. So I think I want to be hopeful, but I think any hope in my mind rests in the hands of the masses and the working people of Venezuela. It's not in any one person or any leading figure or set of figures, but in the movement of working people, which I do have faith that that can succeed.
Hey, look at that. A discussion about Venezuela that ends on a positive note. I love it. I think that it goes without saying, too, that if you're against U.S. imperialism and for what's going on in Venezuela, that you're obviously not going to find any friends in the Democratic Party. And so, when it comes to when looking forward to the Biden administration, we will likely see very little change. We will see a continued sanctions regime. And it's the goal, I think, of, and echoing what Max said, I think all of us need to make sure that we stay steadfast against all of that, whether it's against Russia or China or Iran or Venezuela. And so that's a task of the U.S. left, and definitely something that we all can unite behind and get behind, regardless of our disagreements. So Anya, Max, Brandon, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, having this conversation. Although it went like an hour and a half, I still think it's scratched the surface of a very, very, very deep topic. And so, always open invitation to have any conversation, that revolves around these very important topics. Check out the Reform and Revolution magazine from DSA that Brandon writes for, and of course, check out I just consume everything that the Gray Zone puts out, because everything you guys do is awesome. And so, good people, good reporting. Anya did an amazing interview with the foreign minister that I could listen to that guy talk for hours, because he's awesome. So check that out. Check out the Gray Zone, and of course, Sensible Socialist. You can find that stuff anywhere. I don't need to advertise myself. You're listening to the podcast. So thanks, you guys. I really appreciate it. And
thanks to you, Kevin.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Kevin.
See you later. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Sensible Socialist podcast. This podcast is supported by listeners like you, and no advertisements or anything will ever be said. If you want to support the podcast, please go to patreon.com/sensiblesocialist and give today. Also, please give us a review or a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast, as it greatly helps. All right. See you next time.